Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ghosts and ghouls. My name is Ft.Papa, and welcome to the spookiest radio show around, bringing you the creepiest tales to keep you up at night. If you enjoy my show, give the bell a click to be notified when I go on air. Every other Sunday, we are live. Now for this evening, I promised you that we would have a special guest joining us for tonight's show. So without further ado, let's welcome our friend Papa Scare.
Hello, Fetch. Thank you for having me. It truly is wonderful to be here with you this evening.
It's an honor having you here, friend. Now before we get into the show, do tell us about yourself and what you do.
Well, I run a small YouTube channel where I read scary stories. I tend to prefer to stick to mainly true accounts of the paranormal because, whilst fictional horror is great and all, I feel it is important to remind people that there are plenty of things they have to fear in day-to-day life without the need of made-up monsters. I also like to take photos of clouds.
That's absolutely lovely. Now, my new neighbor might be a little noisy, so my apologies in advance. We have never had a clown move in.
Tasty, tasty beer. Oh.
What was that?
I have no idea what you're talking about, but I wonder who that could be. I'm so sorry. Give me one moment, please.
No worries, take your time.
Okay, this better be good.
Hello, I just wanted to come say hello. Would you like a boat? It's a nice boat.
No.
Oh, why don't you want to play with the clown?
Who was that?
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Now, folks, it's time to dive into tonight's stories. So turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's sink into the tales that await you. Take it away, Papa Scare. One moment, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Shut up! Okay. Thank you.
The idea of grandmas we get from Hallmark movies is that they are the sweetest people in the world, always ready to bake cookies or read you a bedtime story while they tucked you under the covers. This was not my grandmother in the least, who nearly terrified me as a kid. She wasn't physically abusive, but she played games with your head, making you feel as if you're always in the wrong, and her guilt trips were the worst. She also only had one right arm because her other got caught in some machine or something like that. I truly don't remember what lie she told all of us about how it got cut off. This, however, wasn't what was unusual about her. Her husband died under mysterious circumstances about when I was 5 years old, and my grandmother told all of us how he went to go chop firewood but never returned home. My parents believed it, and so did the police officers. At the time, I did too, until I later spent a summer with her because my parents wanted us to build a relationship together, and they didn't want to leave me home alone during the day while they were at work. I was 7 when my parents dropped me off at her creaky old home. On the porch was my grandmother, rocking back and forth in a chair, who didn't even get up to greet me, but just sat there, intimidatingly glaring at me. My parents had a brief talk with her before they drove off, leaving me there with only my dog Rufus for comfort. "Hi, Grandma," I muttered while looking at my feet. She didn't say hi back, but said while glancing at my dog, "I didn't know you were going to bring that dreadful mutt here. I can't have him wandering and making a ruckus about my house and garden." Not knowing how to respond, I replied, "Well, I'll make sure he'll stay far from your garden, and I'm responsible for any accidents he causes." "You better stick to your word about that, and you also need to stay far away from my garden with your trampling feet," she replied bitterly, as she stood up and led me inside. I followed in after her with my stomach aching on the thought about how my summer was ruined and that I wouldn't be able to enjoy it one bit. Spacing out for a moment there, I felt the leash tug away from my grasp, and before I knew it, Rufus was jumping up onto my grandmother. "Rufus, come back! Down, boy!" I screamed with my heart jumping out of my chest. My grandmother nearly stumbled because of him, and she grabbed a large book off one of the shelves in the hallway and began to hit my dog back right in the snout. Trying to save my dog from her blows, I lunged forward and grabbed a hold of the leash. Swiftly, I pulled Rufus away, who quickly scurried between my legs while letting out high-pitched whines. Gently petting the top of his quivering head, I glanced back at my grandmother, who had a smile on her face. Her mouth opened, letting her yellow teeth shine as she said, "Now that dog won't do that again to me because he'll know what will happen. If you break any of my rules, especially the one about entering my garden, you'll be put through the same lesson as him." I do have to say again that she never ended up hitting me at any time while I was staying with her, but at the same time, I was scared to death of it. So I did everything to stay on her good side, which is nearly impossible and only achievable when she was high off her medications. The one rule she told me every day was that I was not to enter her garden, which I hadn't even seen what it looked like yet. To pass the time, I would take Rufus on long walks on the dirt road, which rarely saw any traffic. However, one of the times I was out along the road, a truck stopped right beside me, and there was a husky-looking man behind the wheel. He said, "You Miss Jerry's grandson, right?" I said yes, and he went on to say, "That's interesting. I knew she had 2 kids, but I don't know how they made it out of there. No offense, but I think your grandmother is a little insane. And old John, who was her husband, who had Alzheimer's later in his life, she took advantage of him because of it. Your grandfather was a great man, and I never understood why he married such a terrible little." The man stopped talking as he looked behind me at my grandmother, who was standing there with her one arm holding the stub of her other. She then bursted out loudly saying, "Henry, you keep your dirty, worthless lies away from my grandson. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." I glanced back at the man, who quickly pulled down the brim of his cap and drove off, leaving behind a lingering dust cloud. My grandmother walked beside me and my dog as we headed back to her house. "Everything that man told you were lies. He's just saying those things because he's mad I never left your grandfather for him." She rambled on for a while after this, but at that age, I didn't really know what exactly she was talking about. All I did know was that my grandmother really must have had a bad reputation. When we got back to the house, she had me tie up Rufus to the fence, which I was against, because he was used to running free back at my parents' home. However, she didn't want him to make a mess inside her home, and she especially didn't want him to get into her garden. So reluctantly, I agreed, fearing that backlash if I disobeyed her. She then made me pull up weeds from the front of her house, which was covered in them. As I was doing this, the same truck from before parked in front, and Henry came out. He took off his hat, which he held firmly in both hands, as he walked to my grandmother's front door. Knocking on it, my grandma opened up and said loudly, "What do you want?" "I'm sorry for what I said about you earlier, and I didn't mean it. If there's a way I could make it right, please let me know," Henry asked with his eyes hanging low. My grandmother smirked as she rubbed the end of her stump arm and said, "Sure, follow me to my garden." Wanting to see what would happen, I closely followed them, wondering why everyone seemed so scared of my grandmother. Yeah, she was mean, but there should be no reason to be afraid of her. As I followed them for a half a mile on my grandmother's large area of land she owned, I finally saw what her garden was, and it's not what I had imagined. It didn't have any plants or vegetables, but rather it was a small orchard of trees, all lined up, but there was one of the trees among them that stood in the very middle. It was by far the largest of them, and I watched as my grandmother skillfully used one hand to unlock the large gate with barbed wire covering the top of it that surrounded the trees. Swiftly, I maneuvered and made sure to stay out of sight, wanting to know what they were talking about. When I got close enough to them, I could hear my grandmother say, "Here, Henry, I wanted to show you my favorite tree." It was the first one out of all of these, and I actually stumbled upon it. "It's a beauty, but what exactly do you need me to do?" Henry replied while scratching the back of his head. "I'll get to that, but first feel how smooth the trunk of it is. my grandmother said while gesturing to the tree. Henry then said, somewhat confused as his hand glossed across the tree's surface. Okay, I guess I will. Huh. It has some sort of waxy coating on it. Indeed it does, my grandmother said with a smirk as she walked over and grabbed the rake that was leaning on the fence. Now, what I really want you to do is rake up all of the leaves in this fence and bag them. Then you will have my forgiveness. Henry agreed and started to rake them up, and my grandmother started to head for the gate, which I quickly ran out of, and back to where I was pulling weeds. When she walked by me, I acted like I didn't know anything about what she had Henry go and do. She stopped beside me and said, "Hey, there's a pack of coyotes that have been roaming behind the house, so if you want to be safe, stay away from back there. You might hear strange sounds, but no, that's what they sound like." I told her I would stay away, but knew that she was lying to me. Coyotes don't sound like someone screaming, and Henry was back there, so it couldn't be that dangerous. She walked away, leaving me there to think upon what she had told me. Later that night, long after the sun had gone down, I noticed that Henry's truck was still in the driveway. So I asked my grandma about it, and she replied saying, "Oh yeah, he asked if he could park it there because he didn't have any room back at his house, because he just got a newer truck. In fact, he's looking to sell that one." Even at that young age, I knew that she was lying to me again, but I didn't want to call her out because then she'd find out I followed them, and that would not end well for me. So instead, I acted as if what she had said was the truth, but I really was wondering what happened to Henry because from what I saw, nothing strange happened other than when he touched the tree. As my grandmother headed off to bed, I remembered that I still hadn't fed Rufus, who was still tied up to the fence post outside. Filling his dog bowl with food, I quickly took it out to him, but when I saw that he escaped by gnawing through the leash, my heart dropped. "Rufus, where are you? Rufus, here, boy!" I yelled out frantically, trying to find him. My grandmother's bedroom light flickered on. I knew she wasn't going to be happy with me. Not because the dog was lost, but rather because I woke her up. I then heard barking coming from behind the house. Not waiting for another moment, I quickly dashed after him. Behind me, I could hear my grandma screaming at me to come back, but I wasn't going to lose my dog to coyotes or whatever was really back there. Following the barks that were mixed with some sort of wailing, I could tell they were coming from the garden. When I finally found Rufus, I was completely out of breath with my hands on my knees. He didn't acknowledge my presence but stayed firmly barking at the dark abyss that laid behind the fence. "What is it, boy?" I asked as I gently rubbed my hand across the back of his fur. That's when something rattled up against the fence, spooking him and I. Glancing around to see what made it, I then saw a figure leaning against the other side of the fence. On closer inspection, I could tell it was Henry, and he was spitting up blood. "Help me," he muttered out coarsely. Not knowing what to do, I ran to the entrance gate of the garden. However, it was locked up. I wouldn't dare try and climb it, due to the spiraling barbed wire on top of the fence. As I ran back to where Henry laid against the fence, the full moon peered out from behind the trees, illuminating the woods. That's when I was able to see what was wrong with him, and the thought of him still causes me to shake with unease. There were tree roots, prying out from underneath his skin. I was surprised he was alive due to how gruesomely bloody he was. Not knowing what to do and only being about 7 years old, I started crying my eyes out while tightly grasping Rufus, who continued to bark at Henry's dying body. "I told you not to come over here," I heard my grandmother yell as she walked closer to where I sat with my head between my legs. She then firmly grabbed me and yanked me back to the house, completely ignoring Henry's agonizing cries for help. Bawling my eyes out, Rufus tried to lick the tears that were streaming down my face. I didn't understand anything that was going on, and all I could think about was the man's face with the edges of roots coming out and then going back into his skin. He was lucky they hadn't pierced his eyes yet. My grandmother soon took me inside the house and sat me on my bed before she said, "If you ever tell anyone about what you saw, you'll turn out just like Henry." Horrified, I responded back saying, "I won't, I promise. But what happened to him?" She took some time before responding with, "Since you promised not to tell, I will tell you. I have an extremely rare tree in my garden, and that's why I didn't want you to go near it. This tree is special in how it recreates. It produces its microscopic seeds in a waxy coating it exerts on the outside of itself. The way it spreads them is that whenever someone or something touches it, the seeds stick inside of the pores of the skin. They quickly take root and, in a matter of hours, can overtake an entire body with their roots killing the host." She stopped as she picked up her stub arm, saying, "I touched it once, and I knew I had to cut off my arm to save my life. I lied to everyone to cover it up, so they wouldn't cut down my trees. Don't tell your parents that happened. Same with everything else I've told you." Looking at her arm, and remembering back onto the man's horrid face, I wanted to just run away, as far as I could from that place. She made me promise again not to tell anyone, and told me I would end up like Henry if I did. I never have told anyone until I posted this story to Reddit. I don't know the exact name of the tree, but it could even be extinct right now because after my grandmother died, they ended up cutting down and paving those trees to make way for more homes that they wanted to put into that area. I don't know if they found the bones of the people there, but all I do know is that I'm careful about touching trees now, and I never visited my grandmother again after the end of that summer because she only lived 2 more years afterward. I wasn't sad when I was at her funeral. Instead, all I could think about was what happened that summer I spent with her. Sometimes I think it was just a dream, but Henry's suffering face was too real to be made up. I will finish this by warning you to be careful around trees that you haven't seen before. And if there's a waxy coating on them, then you better be ready to cut off your arm, as my grandmother did.
Well, that wraps up today's interesting show. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Also, special thanks to Pop Scared for joining me this evening. Phenomenal voice you have. If you guys want to give his channel a visit, I highly suggest you do. He's really close to 500 subscribers. Let's get him there. He has a variety of content that will captivate you at first sight. I'll leave his info in the description below. But that's all for now. Thank you for tuning in and tune back in next Sunday. My name is Ft.Papa.
My name's Papa Scare.
Signing off.